would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Gundungurra land and people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you, our listeners, are joining us from today. I recognise the deep connection that First Nations people have to this land, their enduring culture, and their commitment to the preservation and care for their country. This land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Hey there, and welcome to Beyond the Surface, the podcast where we explore the stories of people who have survived religious trauma, left high control or cult communities, and are deconstructing their faith. I'm your host, Sam, and each week I'll talk with individuals who have taken the brave step to start shifting their beliefs that might have once controlled and defined their lives. Join us as we dig into their experiences, the challenges they've faced, and the insights they've gained. Whether you're on a similar journey or you're just curious about these powerful stories, you're in the right place. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Jacqui. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Sam. Glad to be here.
I was saying before we hit record that I really love people who are in the same time zone as me, because I love being able to say good morning and know that the other person is actually in the morning. It's always nice to chat to someone in this part of the world. There's like a nice sense of familiar when talking to someone who has an Aussie or a New Zealander accent. It's just nice. So before we kick straight in, where in the world are you?
I am in Melbourne.
Amazing. Melbourne is beautiful. If people around the world have not been to Melbourne, I went there for the first time in June just this year, and loved it. It's just like full of culture and really, really good coffee. Which is
Yeah.
just like that's a defining factor as to where's
Which is funny. I'm a stove topper. So even though I live in the city of coffee,
yeah.
I just really love my little espresso stovetop. And so, but what's funny is because it's obviously strong,
Yeah.
though not as strong as some who like you put a spoon in it, it stands upright. But I think now it's forever challenged my when I go to a coffee shop, it now doesn't feel strong enough.
Oh yeah, it would
I'm
feel
like, I
really
need a
weak.
triple shot.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's fair.
And I should say I'm actually on Bunurong land. So I
Right.
love that you
Yes.
do acknowledgement of country at the start of your pod. And
Yes.
so I am in Melbourne on Bunurong land.
Lovely. And it's in my acknowledgement, but I am always recording on Gundungurra land. I'd never record anywhere else. But I love to start these podcasts with a really lovely, broad, vague question that catapults the rest of the episode, which is, where does your story start?
It's I was listening to your last episode with I think it was Matthias,
Yeah.
and so that was helpful because I'm thinking, okay, she's going to ask that question. So I think probably the best place to start is I was a child of the 80s,
Right.
and I loved big hair 80s rock.
Hmm.
I think even in 1980 at a school fete got face paint of Kiss, and I was Gene Simmons. So that kind of gives listeners a bit of an idea about, the upbringing that I was having, which is probably, a bit at odds with conservative Christianity.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, I loved my childhood was quite idyllic in many ways. I loved summer. I loved Slurpees. I was
Hmm.
always longing for school holidays. It was really a typical Aussie childhood. I had a swimming pool in the backyard, three older sisters, always had two dogs and two cats. So it was a very busy, lively household, always had other kids over. So really happy childhood. I guess what was probably different for me is that I had a deep spiritual yearning.
Mm.
So I can remember lived in an agnostic household. So my, family, my parents believed in a higher power, but perhaps in more of that, agnostic way. But church wasn't part of my upbringing.
Mhm.
But as I often say to people, I was a pretty spiritual kid.
Mm.
And so I can remember having D&Ms with my friend's mum, who was a Christian, at about 10, 11, and 12,
Yeah.
and asking, the big questions of why are we here? I was always looking up into space and thinking, what's that all about? Quite a soulful kid. So whilst I was, loving Slurpees and 80s rock, I think I dreamt a lot as well.
Yeah.
And so I think my thought life and was a big, you know, which in some ways was at odds with the 80s, which is it was superficial in some ways.
Mm.
Um, Great. Fashion, not so much, but it was great in many ways. But I think people who wanted a deeper meaning in life, it wasn't so good with that. And I think maybe that's what actually attracted me to church. So
Mm.
I ended up going to church with a friend. So my friend whose mum was Christian, and I started going to church I went to Girls Brigade in primary school, and then I started going to church on my own in about year 7.
Yeah. I love chatting to people who didn't grow up in a Christian household because that's also my story. So it's so, I find it so interesting. Um, I mean, maybe it's because I wasn't born in the 80s, but I love 80s fashion. Like, I don't know what, maybe it's just because like I didn't grow up in it that I look back and I go, 80s fashion was sick. Like, I have some of my mum's pieces of clothing that I'm like, I love that now. Um, okay, what was it like for you I mean, like year 7, you're what, like 12, 13? I would imagine.
Yeah, so turning
Yeah.
13.
Turning
Yeah.
13, yeah. What was it like going to a church at that age on your own, on your own volition? And also, what flavor of church was it?
Baptist. So
Right.
the local Baptist church, Mentone Baptist Church.
Hmm.
And look, my first church experience was actually really good.
Yeah.
It was a very community-based church. Um, they, yeah, unlike other people with, a religious trauma where it was coercive from the get-go. That wasn't my experience. I think Mentone Baps was a really community. We had a great youth group. We did lots of fun things. Like we had something called Sing on Sundays where we'd invade someone's house and go and sing choruses out of the chorus books and then
Right.
eat Kim Tams after. Like it was sort of a good Christian living in many ways.
Yeah.
I think, I'm still friends with my pastor's daughter. So all of these years later, I'm still friends with people that I went to Mentone Baps with.
Mm.
Um, I guess what's different for me is perhaps my deconstruction journey, like healthcare, I'm a mental health nurse, is there's lots of wonderful things about church and religion, but when the system meets the needs of the system and not the people,
Yeah.
you have a problem, and that system then becomes toxic. So I guess now I look back on my first church experience and realize that some of those coercive beliefs about purity culture,
Mm.
um, that binary thinking, I can remember being in that church and there was a young gay man and, feeling a lot of um, sadness about his experience because, he didn't fit in. And whilst I don't think we were overtly aggressive, but I think there was a lot of mocking and bullying.
Mm.
Fortunately, he's gone on to be a very successful interior designer. So it's like success is the best revenge,
Hmm.
um, and lives in Sydney. Um, but I think back to that time, and I think, in many ways, I was an observer.
Mm.
I've always, where some might call it the wallflower, um, I think throughout my life, even as young as a 13-year-old, I would often sit on the outside looking in and be assessing what's happening. And I think that personality type helped me in nursing because nursing's all about observation.
Hmm.
Um, so I think I'm a natural born observer and used to look at church even way back then as a 13-year-old and thinking some of this is good, but some of this isn't.
Mm.
And as a person who lived in a family who was agnostic and advocates, my family, if anyone wants to get to understand me, they need to meet my family because um, we just have a natural born advocacy.
Yeah.
That's, kind of built into us. Supposedly 100 years ago, one of our relatives let all the dogs out of the dog carriage that they were collecting stray dogs, and they've gone up the back of it and opened it and let them all out. So
Love
that
that.
kind of really
Mm,
describes who we are as people, that we just want to see life improved.
mm,
I think so. A core, and I think the other thing is I had my first spiritual experience at 14.
mm,
And it was one that I had on my own. It wasn't a church, wasn't in a church, it was on a camp. And I was out, well, we were out on a night hike.
mm.
But I was sort of walking ahead. I think I was a moody teenager and had enough of their shit. Um, but really had this really meaningful religious experience, or not religious experience, spiritual experience of just having a connection with God.
Yeah.
So I think throughout my Christian life, that has always been a really helpful anchor because my faith and my spirituality has always been mine.
Mm,
And I really connected what Matthias said in that episode where, I think you asked the question of how did he hold on to it?
mm.
And I think I was able to hold on to my faith because it was always mine.
Yeah.
Um, and whilst, and I guess in some ways it took leaving the institution of church to
Mm,
claim it back.
yeah.
And that's where I'm at the moment.
Yeah. I'm curious what it was like for you to shift from the beliefs about yourself and the world that you got from your parents growing up in an agnostic home to the beliefs that you started to internalize about yourself and the world from the church that you were in as a teenager.
Great question. They, as a family, and look, it was back in the 80s and 90s, and we were all a bit less PC back then. Um, they struggled with it,
Yeah.
and I think for my parents, and let's be honest, the 80s and 90s religion was very binary, opinionated. And you talked about this in the last podcast too, we're right, you're wrong. So I appreciate that when I was a teenager, and teenagers are pretty opinionated anyway.
I think they still are.
Yeah,
I don't think
exactly.
that's changed.
They know everything at 18.
Yeah.
Um, in that I look back at that time now and realize that I was different to my family because I had different beliefs, partly my own, but partly informed by the church I was going to.
Mm,
That is heavily influenced by Southern Baptists in America, but had an Aussie flavour. And I don't think we were, or not my church anyway, were as intense as the Baptists I hear people talk about in the States.
yeah.
But I still think that arrogance and we're right and you're wrong informed it. So I kind of have, major cringe when I think back to times like that. But I listened to it was so random. It was a interview with a ex-football player who's like 50. This is a couple of years ago or last year or something. And he said, I'm not going to talk shit about my younger self
Mm,
because that's what I knew then.
mhm.
And this is what I know now. And I've really claimed that because regret. And then last year I read a really amazing book, The Power of Regret by Daniel Pink.
Mm,
Brene Brown interviewed him. That was really meaningful for my deconstruction as well, because I think regret is a powerful emotion
yeah.
and it actually helps us improve going forward. So when we look back and sort of go, oh God,
Mm,
that actually is helpful because we learn from that. But, for me, I'm not hashtag no regrets. I'm actually hashtag learn from regret.
yeah.
Um, and so I think for me in that state of deconstruction, I do feel, some of my triggers are actually, shit, I was such an asshole, or I
Mm,
was, so opinionated or whatever,
yeah.
but that's no longer who I am. So,
Mm.
and that's the growth of adulting, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, the right versus wrong is just like moral superiority that church
Mm.
systems breed, which that's often like I remember feeling and knowing that like I had that moral superiority, and it's like the weirdest dichotomy to sort of look at the way that I view that now. But I think it's just moving from a place of self-criticism to a place of self-compassion and going,
Mm.
like, she did all she knew. Like, of course, she had a sense of moral superiority. Of course, she believed those things. It's what she was taught, right? And it's
Mm.
so, it's now sort of going, but it's the same, that's the same self that actually got us to this point that's going, that's deconstructing, that's going, hey, that's not okay. It's like an evolved version of ourselves.
Mm.
And we need all of those versions to be able to have hit the point where we are now.
Yeah.
Um, so, what was it like for you in your sort of like young adulthood? Were you, I describe myself as like a black and white, all or nothing, knee deep in church. That was kind of me. Was that your experience?
No, definitely not. So, and I was just reflecting. I went to a all girls state school, and I think in many ways, and I interviewed Fiona Newton on my podcast about that. We went to school together, and
Mm,
we both reflected on the fact that in many ways that was protective,
yeah.
because in school and then nursing, um, I was encouraged to be a strong female. I was encouraged to be an advocate for other women, and really taught that I could be anything I wanted to be. And then I lived in a family like that as well. So,
Yeah.
five women and a male in a household. And, my parents, were a partnership before that was, even a thing in many ways. And so I think I was fortunate to have a lot of protective factors, but also a lot of balancing factors. It's probably even a better word that, so whilst I was in church and I really connected with that spiritual experience, I was always discontent with some of it because I thought it doesn't fit. So, as a young adult, what immediately came to mind is I was drunk a lot,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that didn't fit church, And so through that time, I did sadly experience a lot of shame,
Mm,
and I guess that's what we go to therapy now for. But I think in many ways, particularly as a young adult, but even still now, I really resonated with what you said about having a foot on both sides of the Grand Canyon.
yeah.
That that I've never really fit. I was always a square peg in a round hole, and so I was too Christian for people that didn't go to church, but I wasn't Christian enough
Yeah.
for people that were in church. And so I kind of ended up living a bit of a nomadic life.
Mm,
But in some ways, it actually suited me because I think what I've been learning in my deconstruction is I am a freestyler by person, like by personality. Like even when I was in high school, I was a floater.
yeah.
So, I'd have friends, I had a group of friends that I hung out with, and then I'd have a group of church friends, and then I'd have a group in the year level above me, and then I would often do school production. So I was never sort of stuck in one spot. I was the kind of person that really um, felt happiest when I had a rich
Mm,
community in different places. And I think those of us in the deconstruction space have a lot of work to do to deconstruct theology, particularly for those of us that want to remain in faith.
yeah.
Um, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of reframing and understanding theology with what its intention was, whereas we're only looking at it through the lens of evangelical,
Yeah.
rather than saying, like Psalm 23, the valley of the shadow of death. Well, anyone who has depression can
Mm-hmm.
relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for me as I guess a person who is holding on to some of the content in the Bible,
Mm,
what I've probably, and that part of that was I learned many years ago about looking for the timeless principle. I think, Sam, what's really helped me through this journey is healthcare
mm,
is actually having is in a state of deconstruction as well.
Yeah.
And so I often joke that I'm in a state of double deconstruction.
Yeah.
I think in many ways it's helping me
Mm.
because rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Mm.
I love healthcare, you
Yeah.
know. So for me, it's about I want to see healthcare be good and healthy
Mm.
and hold on to what is good, but get rid of the shit that, which is something you said before, made me think of, that superiority. Healthcare has that with doctors,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
don't question, the medical fraternity, like they know everything. Well, they don't actually. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think for me, that's been really helpful in my religious deconstruction, or because it's sort of like I still want to hold on to my faith,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I know that when I meet clients that have been traumatized by, then how does faith need to be reconstructed so it's safe for them?
Mm.
And that's partly, I think that's the work of all of us doing this work is,
Mm.
not to throw, for me anyway, and I appreciate other people have a different opinion, but for me, it's not to throw out spirituality.
Yeah.
We can throw out religion. I'm happy with that, the man-made institution.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I want to hold on to spirituality because, as I said, that's always been meaningful for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, we, just as we are mental, emotional, physical beings, we are also spiritual beings, and spiritual doesn't necessarily have to have anything associated with religion or even divinity, but like spirituality is like a connection to yourself and to the world around you and to nature and to, things like that. And so I think in some ways, we all have an element of spirituality. It's just finding what is the most authentic part of that for us to
Mm.
be able to connect with ourselves. Um, I'm curious, you sort of like described the floating around and the nomadic part of you.
Mm.
Did you find that that made it easier or more difficult to feel grounded within yourself?
That's a big question.
It's called Beyond the Surface, Jacqui.
Yes, I did look at that title this morning and thought, oh shit, this is going to be fun. No, but look, as a fellow therapist, you know, I get that. I think it's both because I think, like Brene Brown would say, and we have a natural desire to connect
Yeah.
and to be seen and to be part of community.
Mm.
But I guess in many ways, because I've often not fit in to different parts in my life for lots of reasons. I think being a nomad is my value. So I really, one of my core values is I value freedom. And so I think for me that nomadic spirit is partly because of that. I don't like to be confined.
Mm.
Um, so whilst I will still, like, ironically, I'm a nurse, so and nurses traditionally start in the system, but I quickly left the hospital system and then went to community health, which was such a better fit because it had freedom in
Yeah.
that, that I could move around. I wasn't, so don't get me wrong, I admire my colleagues who work in hospitals, but for me, I just, like a plant, I was in the wrong environment. And so when I found community health, I was like, oh, this is so much better. And then I was fortunate to find a job that offered me a lot of autonomy.
Yeah.
I think for me, like any person,
Mm.
connecting with who I am and not, when we want to belong, we sometimes adopt the behaviors of others or the beliefs of others because we want to connect. We see that in teenagers. They all want to be individual, but then they all dress the same.
Yeah, I mean, like to quote Brene Brown again, we often will trade authenticity for belonging, right?
Mm.
It's the need for belonging sometimes surpasses our need to be ourselves.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I think it's been a wrestle, and I think it's been both good and hard. But I think, you know,
Mm.
being raised as an advocate in my family, in my school, and then in my career, I think that has always, I've pissed
Mm.
off a lot of men in leadership. because
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, why are we doing it that way? Or I would ask questions at other people. And I experienced a lot of workplace trauma as a result of that. So I think now the work that I do is
Mm-hmm.
often around institutional trauma. So whether it's religion, whether it's healthcare, or whether medical trauma, or whether it's workplace trauma, because, you know, um, I pissed off a lot of men in churches, particularly male leaders, because I'd say, why are we doing it that way? And they were like, you know,
Yeah.
you could see them fluff up their feathers, all that posturing, because they're like, who are you as a woman to ask me this? And I'm like,
Mm.
well, I'd been taught I was allowed to. Um, you know, and I think what I'm learning is that it's the hard, whilst they're
Mm.
really hard experiences to live, they
Yeah.
have all taught me valuable lessons. And so I think I'm also, in a culture of
Mm.
consumerism that's obsessed with comfort. But then I've had the fortune of working with a lot of community clients that come from hard backgrounds, whether it's migrant backgrounds
Mm.
or whether it's family violence backgrounds, that it's often in the hard parts of life, or farmers who are,
Mm.
they're like resilience personified. Um, I think I'm learning that not to avoid hard things.
Yeah.
And I love that podcast with Glennon Doyle, We Can Do Hard Things.
Mm.
Because I think in a culture that's obsessed with comfort,
Mm.
which that's equally coercive, is actually just to sort of approach life as, fuck, this is hard. um, F bomb for emphasis, and then find a pathway through that.
Yeah. I mean, and I think like I love Glennon saying we can do hard things because it reminds us that actually we have the capacity to do the hard things and come out on the other side as well. And I think we too often we think that we don't have that capacity to be able to move through the hard stuff in life. But actually, we have an immense amount of capacity. We've just been told otherwise by the systems and by the higher people around us. Um, you talked a little bit about being raised as that like strong, independent woman and that strong, like feminine part in your identity. And so I'm curious how that intersected with the very masculine archetype of God that you would have been presented with.
Good question. I'm just going to quickly reflect back on the hard
Yeah.
things. Think of all the people that do marathons,
Mm.
ultra marathons,
Yeah.
Camino Trail, Kokoda Trail. At the moment, we are in a culture
Mm.
of comfort,
Mm.
and people are seeking out things that put their body under duress.
Mm.
I think that's an interesting reflection,
Yeah.
because it's a paradox of life. I don't think we're meant to be hurt,
Mm.
but we're meant to struggle.
Mm.
Even a baby coming out into the world, there's an element of struggle. And so it's just a paradox of life
Mm.
that struggle strengthens us. I think there's always a limit. And you and I, as therapists, know that, we talk about that with our clients, that, there's a line of harm.
Mm.
But at the same time, humans are really benefit from struggle, and how any farmer seriously can plant another crop after losing it the year before, it just floors me,
Yeah.
because I think I try and really hold on to that. So when I'm complaining about whatever, I think of my, fellow Australian farmers who just teach us
Mm.
what resilience looks like.
Yeah.
Back to your question, I think like Matthias, and again, I just listened to it this morning. I've always connected with a loving God,
Mm.
and I think I really loved the movie The Shack.
Oh, yeah.
'Cause Octavia Spencer as God was just perfect casting, in my
Yeah.
opinion. And I read that book, and then I watched the movie, and then equally the male version of God is the Mexican, or the South American God.
Yeah.
Really, it I think in many ways. And I also had a father who was very emotionally available.
Yeah.
So I guess in some ways I had parents who, you know, a kind of traditional in because of their age, because but then in many ways, Dad was very, he was the one I was in year 12, I'm going to fail, and he would sit with me and Mum would be like, you'll be right, get on with it, good stoic Dutch woman. But then Dad was the one who would often sit with us when we were struggling. And so I think I was really fortunate to grow up with parents that access both sides of that they had both female and male attributes.
Yeah.
So I guess for me, I was always, and I loved movies too. So I think I also really connected with movies where men were represented as compassionate people, like Good Will Hunting, with Robin Williams as the person that helped this young man find himself. And so I think all of those things have helped me, you know, and when I'm struggling, I really just focus on I look at the best in humanity, and I think the best of humanity for me represents God. And reminding myself that the shitty behavior of people is not God, and that for me anyway, God is seen in the best of people.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really helped me kind of connect with the masculine, because my belief of masculine is not that toxic masculinity. My understanding of masculinity is the father who shows empathy and compassion and kindness.
Yeah. I think as you're talking, it reminds me of actually, it was the second episode that I released of the podcast, so it was a while ago. But
Yeah.
with Will Small, who hosts the Spiritual Misfits podcast, and when I asked him about holding on to his faith, he talked a little bit about changing the point of reference of the Christians that he was around. And if your frame of reference is always the worst kind of Christians, then of course that's going to be awful. But that's not all of those people, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that we can take that mentality to a lot of different spaces other than religion. But it is about shifting that frame of reference to rather than, and it's also moving out of that all or nothing thinking that church tends to give you anyway, that sort of pendulum that we're either all good or all bad, but actually there's a shitload of grey in that black and white.
Oh, navigating the grey. And that's actually something a lovely male, who's now a minister, was at the time. That was I met him at a Bible college, but he taught me about navigating the grey. So, I think I've been fortunate to have different people in my life that have, have just given me a different perspective. But even most recently, I really love the series Grantchester. It's a UK series set in the 50s. A cop and a priest solve crimes, and it's funny. It's a bit like The Vicar of Dibley, but different. But the Anglican priests are flawed human beings.
Yeah.
It's stories by people for people, and I really love that series because whilst it's funny and it's all focused around solving another crime in this tiny weeny town, it does such a good job at building on the character of a person and how we grow as people when we strengthen each other. So actually, as we develop closeness and as we are a bit vulnerable with each other and authentic with each other, that actually we can bring out the best in one another. So I love that series so much.
You talk a lot about your life in healthcare and nursing, and so my former anti-evolution self has got to ask, what is it like for you to balance faith and science? Because some would suggest that those things are in opposition.
Well, they're not, because the origin of science was actually theologians. So a lot of a lot of the, I want to say fathers of science, but I don't like that term because there was a lot of women as well. They just weren't.
Founders of science.
Yeah, founders of science.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. But I think the founders of science held both faith and
Mm.
science together. But, you know, I mean, I did nursing. You know, I think I'm a fairly practical person, and I never really um, believed in, you know, the world forming in 7 days. And
Mm.
I was learning about evolution at school. And I think as a, you know, an inquiring mind, I kind of, I think when things were too hard, I would just put them in the, not the too hard basket, but I don't know.
Mm.
So I'll just, I don't, you know, like, and I think I used to look up the expanse of, you know, the sky and sort of go, there's so much we don't know.
Mm.
But even the human body is a universe in itself in many ways. And so I think, you know, I was just able to, with the balance I had in my life of school and
Mm.
nursing, and the church I went to wasn't overtly, you know, Genesis,
Mm.
you know, kind of evolution. So I don't think that was ever one of our main focuses.
Mhm.
Um, you know, you probably think about that and go, but yeah, but I also love Jurassic Park. So
I mean, to be fair, who doesn't? I just drank out of like a mug this morning that says, "All I want for Christmas is a dinosaur."
yeah.
Um, it's great. Um, I mean that sense of being able to put things in the I don't know basket. Has
Mm,
that always felt good, or was there a time? Because I remember like the words I don't know used to instill like an immense amount of panic and anxiety and fear because, I was always taught that I was to be certain and steadfast in my faith and my beliefs and that sort of thing. And so has the phrase I don't know always been a comfort or easy for you, or was there a time where that phrase instilled fear or panic?
I think I've always had a strong opinion. It's a family trait. Um, but I think I would put it aside for belonging.
Mm.
So I think as I, you know, looking back on my Christian life, I would ironically deny myself, and that's Christian language,
Mm.
to be included.
Mm.
And I kind of feel sad that I didn't give myself opportunity to be more unique to self,
Mm.
you know. Um, you know, I'm also a childless cat lady. So in many ways, I just don't fit in society's norms,
Yeah.
you know. But I'm learning to appreciate that and embrace that and see that that offers a different perspective,
Mm.
you know. So, you know, going through your 20s and 30s, particularly in church life, and oh, you're not married, or you don't have kids, or what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
But now that I'm in my late 40s and I talk to a lot of people who are struggling in those systems, feeling a lot of freedom,
Mm.
you know, and so I think that I denied myself for belonging, and so many of us do that,
Yeah.
you know, and I think it was COVID.
Mm.
So like Jane Kennedy, I kind of been deconstructing for a long time, but I think, and I'd had sabbaticals from church over the years. But it was in 2021, I listened to Sarah Steele's podcast, Let's Talk About Sects.
Yes.
Not sex, but sect.
Yeah.
It's a hard one. And it was the episode on the exclusive Brethren Church.
Mm.
And I remember thinking, oh shit, there's a lot of similarities to that, to the churches I've been in, like that coercive control,
Yep.
groupthink. Um, we didn't have to wear long skirts or have our hair long, um,
Yeah.
but there was, it just remember it made me go, oh, that's not good. And so at the start of 2021, I was just like, I need to just go work out what I think,
Mm.
you know. I'm sick of, you know, I'm sick of hearing the same people get up the front and share stuff, because whenever they had someone on there that was sharing their story or something, I'd be like, awesome, and then there'll be the same person again next week, and I'm like, oh, roll my eyes.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, and then I just decided, you know, so I spent 2021 really sort of going, what do I think,
Mm.
you know? that's been hard actually.
Yeah.
So even though I am someone who has a strong opinion,
Mm.
I realize that the opinions of others can suffocate.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, again, that's been a good learning, because now in the counselling work I do, it's really important to me to make sure that I don't give too much information,
Mm.
and that I don't, because healthcare again can be quite informational and overpowering.
Mm.
And so my approach to the work that I do is really ensuring that I come with resources,
Mm.
but my role is really to support the person to work out what's right for them,
Yeah.
you know.
Mm.
So I consider that was a good opportunity, and you know, I have, at this stage I am freestyling.
Mm.
I am really, again, still a person of faith, but I find faith in outside the institution of church.
Yeah. I think in as I record these episodes here and in the stories of my clients and other people that I've connected with online, COVID restricted the world in so many ways, but expanded us in so many
Mm,
ways also. And I mean, to be like, COVID took a hit to churches because
mm,
it was an opportunity for people to not be flooded with what the norm is of like people's beliefs and particularly, straight white middle class men's beliefs onto us. And we had an opportunity to look inward as opposed to outward, and I think that
yeah,
that expanded us in a lot of ways. Um,
I
what's
agree
been the
with that.
most helpful part of your deconstruction journey so far, or the most poignant part?
Um, Podcasts and series actually, because I think, like, Under the Banner of Heaven
Oh, yeah,
was, I mean, I love Andrew Garfield, so that was a help.
yeah.
His other movie, Tick Tick Boom,
Oh,
was just
yes.
a
Yeah,
celebration of all things good.
yeah.
Um, but I really love, and actually Hacksaw Ridge
Mm,
is another movie he's in.
mm,
But I think movies have, a lot of people say, oh, you watch too much TV, but what they don't realize is I'm engaging with the story. For me, it's just, I don't watch rubbish
mm,
TV. For me, I'm
yeah,
looking for good quality stories that people are telling. Ted Lasso, was a wonderful, and
yeah,
again, like, challenging toxic masculinity, and they chose soccer, which is like one of the most toxic systems for men. And here comes this, you know,
mm,
wonderful
yeah,
character of Ted Lasso coming in and showing what, a nurturing, vulnerable man, and the world lapped it up. So I think there's something to be said about, we need
yeah,
to value pop culture more, particularly good quality pop culture, because Schitt's Creek's
yeah.
another one. You know.
Oh, Schitt's Creek has my whole heart. It's like, it just is, and I just love it because, like, as someone within the queer community, Schitt's
Yeah.
Creek just did a top-notch job of presenting like wholesome queer culture and not stereotypical relationships or stereotypically queer people, but just like normal, wholesome, good queerness. And I just
But even like
froth over
loving
it. It's
people that
just
are
I
weird,
love it.
Roland,
So,
man, like, he's a quirky character, but
yes.
the
Yeah.
the relationships that are
Yes.
built in that series are just wonderful, because at first they're like jarring with each other, but as they really connect with, you know,
Mm,
each other, and it's just such a wonderful series in so many ways. So I think podcasts and series, I do. For me, I've been very fortunate to find a lovely spiritual mentor, who's also a
mm,
nurse, who um,
yeah.
I've sort of journeyed with her over about 5 years, so pre-COVID. Um, and at times wrestled with it, but she has, been so helpful in terms of helping me navigate. Because I think, deconstructing, you can do it on your own, but I think finding fellow travelers is, whether it's a counselor or whether it's, some kind of spiritual mentor or someone else, is just finding people who kind of really get you. Um, and also, I think what's been really helpful for her is she's not um, overtly trying to tell me anything as a spiritual mentor, or spiritual companion, they call them. Um, she's just trying to help me develop my spirituality. So I think it's the spiritual equivalent of what counseling is trying to really help someone kind of find themselves. So that's been really helpful. The other thing that probably was really crucial for me was last year I did some mindful self-compassion training. And interestingly, it was led by a psychiatrist, but in a community program. So I think it actually helped me both in my health deconstruction, but equally my faith deconstruction. Because um, I remember in the first, I was going to say episode, I clearly watch a lot of series. In the first session, Peter said, to live is to suffer. And I was like, what the fuck? You know, that's because as a nurse, my whole job is trying to alleviate people's suffering. So I wrestled with that for that whole program. And it really helped me come to settle with that belief that, we can't eliminate suffering, but we can reduce suffering. But really, it sort of gave me a theology of suffering, of that. It's how to hold yourself and how to hold others. We're terrible with grief. We have a lot of work to be done in terms of grief care, because most people are like too hard and then run away, and then people are left alone in their grief. And as you guys said on the one of the episodes, we're not so good with grief. Grief care and religious trauma is often about grief.
Yeah.
So I think for me that was really helpful in kind of contextualizing where I am in my deconstruction journey, and just to sort of take it day by day, like not, and to slow down, like to not feel like it's a problem that needs to be fixed, because I think that's another false belief we live with in the community, whether it's religious trauma or other, that like mental health, it's not meant to be something we fix. It's something we recover from, however that looks. So if it's living with, for some people with psychosis, they might live with voices, but it's learning to live with the voices. It's not getting rid of the voices. And there's a lot of wonderful work being done by people in that space of not seeing people for their deficits, but seeing people for their strengths, and then helping people, kind of, and again, that's non-binary thinking. It's not absence of disease. It's helping people thrive within the limits of this life, I guess, is where I kind of sit now as a person.
Yeah. I mean, I think, something that I often find myself quoting with people and online is, you are good, you have always been good. And it's coming back to, the opposite of what we've been taught, which is that we are broken, but actually that coming back to our inherent goodness at the core of ourself. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in white Western society, we notoriously suck at grief, and suck at most things, to be fair, when it comes to like responding to pain and and anything that would be not under the banner of positivity. So, I think it's just changing. I'm not sure I personally agree with the concept that to live is to suffer, but I think, in life we can't escape pain. And I think it's about changing the way that we respond to pain. And the way we view the purpose of pain. I think maybe it's just the language of
Yeah, and
suffering that I'm going, oh, I don't love that. But and I think, and I'm probably saying that purely because I know that there's probably people out there going, particularly who have been brought up with the notion that suffering is godly and suffering is what we're supposed to do in life. And I think, what we're talking about is that we have the ability to sit in the hard stuff and to respond differently to the hard stuff and to not see the hard stuff as a fault in our system or a fault in our being, that at the core of who we are
I
good.
think,
So
and I
yeah,
appreciate that reflection. I think to contextualize it, we have to acknowledge how our society, Western society's belief is to alleviate, like it's a culture of comfort. But I was fortunate to work
yeah,
with newly arrived migrants and refugees and would listen to their hardships. And I realized that what they had that others didn't, either that I worked with or that I, engaged with in my life, was that when trouble hit, they would they were good problem solvers and they were resourceful. But
mm,
realizing that in a culture of comfort,
mm,
we can have strong reactions to that, you know. And don't get me wrong, the feelings
mm,
are valid. But I think what I learned from that period in
mm,
my work was I learned that, life can be really hard sometimes, and how to journey through it. It's like, the storm analogy of storms will come, but they won't last forever. And how do we
mm,
brace ourselves for them? How do we, prepare for them? And then how do we recover from them, particularly if they've caused, a lot of destruction? And then as a person, how can we help people in the recovery of things? And so I agree with you. It's not, it's not to eliminate suffering, but it's also to, and there's some element of alleviate suffering. But I think as humans, acknowledging that life can be hard and people can fail us, and you know and then how to just,
yeah,
find, um and I think for me, Brene Brown's been really helpful because it's about connecting with my values. And so I think for me, in my deconstruction
mm,
journey, has really, that's what helps me come back to self. Like, so when I am going through difficult things, rather than kind of externalizing and blaming others and all that kind of stuff, I come back to self and think, okay, what need is not being met and how can I meet that for myself? And perhaps move away from a system if it's, not working for me. And you know, and even, in my health deconstruction, as I've moving from the institution to private practice, oh my gosh, I'm learning so much, because private practice has its own challenges.
yeah,
You're working all the time, but you have a lot of freedom, and
yes,
that, systems can alleviate some difficulty because it's the collectives working together to meet a need. So I think it's also helping me appreciate systems can fulfill a function, where there's a group of people working together, and rather than me
yeah,
doing everything in private practice, that in a, organization where it's a group of people, but the health of the organization or the health of the system is paramount to its function. And so
mm,
for me, I think that's really where I kind of
yeah,
sit with now in my work, is a belief of wanting to help improve the system to be more healthy. So health, not just healthy people, but a healthy system, because
mm,
without a healthy system, you won't have healthy people. Um, you know, and so health, and I think I
yeah,
agree with you.
mm,
COVID kind of showed us we can do things differently, like working from home, and then people having more time with their kids and all of that kind of stuff. So I think there's so much that we've learned from COVID that we're still unpacking. But, whether it's healthcare, whether it's religion, whether it's education, whether it's, workplaces, um, how do we help people thrive? And how do we ensure that collectives of people that are like systems of people working together, like sports, another one, is how do we make those systems healthy so people can thrive? And it's challenging work, like, because, when there's people gathered, and there's a lot of opinions, it takes really skilled leaders to navigate that discussion. And I think that's why people resonated with Ted Lasso so much, because I can see they were really trying to show that, a good leader needs to be emotionally intelligent and not just successful and productive, but actually a true leader is someone who can facilitate healthy engagement with other humans. And I don't think we have enough of those in the world, that's for sure. I think, we need more people in leadership that have really good skills with humans, because then, whereas so much of our leadership in the last sort of 10 to 20 years has been about productivity, particularly in church, rather than people that are really good at gathering people, which is why I love the term the religious trauma collective, because it's about, it's because it's about bringing people together, but acknowledging bringing people together inherently can be challenging. So then how do we do that meets the needs of the individual and meets the needs of the collective? And I think in society at the moment, there's work to be done to bring it to the middle. Some people are individualists and just the individual, and others are collectivists and just, the collective. But actually, we need to create environments where people can thrive as an individual and thrive together. And I think that's the challenge and something I'm really passionate about.
And I mean, I think, I often will go back to that, like Deb Dana says, we are hardwired for connection. And so we aren't, yes, we can deconstruct on our own, but I don't think that that's the way that it is supposed to be. I think, we are wired for connection. And so finding safe people and safe connections and safe communities is what has been so healing for so many who are deconstructing, who are potentially post-church or post-religion, is finding safety within community again.
Because I think, Sam, it's dangerous for people to think that religion's the problem.
Yeah.
Because it's actually about coercive control.
Yeah.
Because people can leave the institution and then end up in a relationship or a family or a workplace or a sporting club that has those coercive behaviors. And so don't get me wrong, like, we need to address, the harm that's been caused in religion. But I guess perhaps because I work in healthcare and have worked in other environments where there's collectives of people, and also see a lot of clients that come with their stories, and I see coercive control in schools and in sports and in relationships and in families, that it's really important to me that people realize that it's about coercive control, and that any group or collective of people, are you afforded freedom?
Yeah.
Are you afforded the opportunity to have an opinion? And then if you are, great, because that's a green flag. That's a sign that things are good and safe. But people can equally leave religion and then go to a workplace that's just as toxic, and we've heard many podcasts and many documentaries on that kind of thing. The music industry, Hollywood, perfect example, where, so I think it's, but I guess the particular burden of religious trauma is that it goes to a person's identity. And, but so I think for me, that's why I'm really just passionate about health of systems And if whatever system people are in, if it's meeting, if you sense that the group is trying to meet the needs of the system over the individual, that's a major red flag.
Yeah.
You know, but a good healthy system is about the system meets the needs of the people that use it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I like, the way that I like to end these episodes is to offer some encouragement to those who are listening, who are potentially at the beginning of their journey. And so I like to end by asking, what would you say to someone who is fresh in their deconstruction?
I think for me, and perhaps it's informed by, my counselling role, but connect with self. I think for me, my journey particularly was what's important to me. So I agree with the slow down and not rushing to fix where you're at the moment, but the importance of connecting with self, because in many ways that's probably what's been jarring. And so as you connect with yourself and your values, that will really help going forward to work out where you want to be. Because I think when people experience trauma in whatever kind, sometimes they can isolate from people because people are no longer safe. But I think as we develop a greater sense of connection to self and what our needs are when we interact with people, we can establish safety because we'll go, oh, that's not for me, and move away. So strengthening self and building connection with self is really helpful. So then you can re-engage with others and be able to navigate complicated people.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, I think at the core of any good trauma recovery is a connection and a coming home to self. So I think that's a beautiful space for people to end with. Thank you for joining me.
No worries. Thank you for having me. I hope the listeners find the conversation helpful and, just really encourage them to reach out to someone who really, can journey with them, because deconstructing on your own's pretty hard. And so it's wonderful that Sam and Jane and Elise have created the collective to give us that point of connection to find someone who can help us on that journey.
Thank you. That's lovely. We are really, the privilege is not lost on us to be working and being in this space, and we love it. So, and we are thankful for people who jump along the ride with us. So, yes. So thanks, Jacqui. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Beyond the Surface. I hope you found today's conversation as insightful and inspiring as I did. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who might benefit from these stories. Stay connected with us on social media for updates and more content. I love connecting with all of you. Remember, no matter where you are in your journey, you're not alone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep moving forward. Take care.